The courtroom doors slowly creaked open, and at once, a wave of tension coursed through the room like an intangible storm. All eyes were trained on Kody Brown, the head of the Brown family, a man whose life had been televised for more than a decade, and whose family's drama had been a reality television staple. The air was thick, nearly claustrophobic, as if even the walls of the courtroom were breathing in anticipation. Cameras clicked constantly, flashes lit up every nook and cranny, and reporters murmured in rushed, nervous voices. Some frantically wrote in notebooks, and others shared hushed speculation about what would occur. Rumors had been circulating for weeks, fueling passionate debates among fans, locals, and journalists alike. Rumors of money feuds, allegations of mismanaged money, custody battles, and allegations of favoritism between Kody's wives had saturated headlines and social media. The Brown family, who had made their unusual polygamous lifestyle a brand, were now engulfed in a storm of legal woes that threatened to upend everything. Fans had speculated ad nauseum, but nothing could really prepare for the raw emotion that filled the room that day. Kody walked into the courtroom with calculated self-assurance, his expression serene, but for a fleeting moment of tension that gave him away. His shoes tapped the shining floor in cadence, almost rhythmic, beat by beat, each beat more riveting than the one before it. He wore the finest clothes, a clean-cut suit, precisely knotted tie, but even those could not protect him from the weight of the moment. He understood that today, the world wasn't observing a TV family, they were observing a man, a dad, a husband, a leader, and in many minds the symbol of decades of controversy and public examination. Behind Kody, sitting in separate sections, were his wives, Robyn, Janelle, Christine, and Meri, each reflecting a range of emotion that varied from cautious expectation to silent rage. Robyn's gaze was firm but alert, as if preparing for the tempest of questions and accusations that could fall into her lap. Janelle, poised and refined, had clenched fists from time to time, a fierce but unmistakable sign of tension seething under the surface. Christine's expression was pinched with pent-up anger, a woman who had weathered years of public condemnation and internal ire. And Meri, quietly in the back, looked as if she was separated from the commotion, but her face suggested sorrow, disappointment, and unvoiced resentments. As a group, they embodied not only Kody's wives, but the multifaceted, interwoven dynamics that had defined the Brown family for generations. The courtroom itself appeared to react to the tension. The judge, a strict woman legendary for her unshakable composure, arrived with a soft assurance that at once demanded silence. Her gavel, lying like a brooding sentinel upon the bench, threatened that decorum and justice would dominate above all other considerations. But the atmosphere still hung heavy with expectation, a blend of fear, curiosity, and unresolved drama that clung like a palpable mist over all who stood there. Reporters shoved past each other, vying for the best position, the best shot of the Brown family at this pivotal moment. Microphones danced precariously close, and cameras hummed softly, a mechanical chant that was in harsh contrast to the human passion charging the room. Any movement, any glance, any fleeting catch of an eyebrow could be the headline the next day. And yet, the real story, the story behind the flashes and the whispers, was much more complicated, much more nuanced than any camera could possibly record. This courtroom drama was not solely about law. It was about where public life and private sorrow intersect. Kody Brown had lived most of his adult life in the glare of reality television, where all argument, all disagreement, every intimate moment, had been exposed for millions to analyze. The situation was different this time around. Cameras could show faces, expressions, and gestures but could not expose the wells of agony, of betrayal, of fear that had brought the family to this point. The rumors out in the hallway, of lawsuits, disputed custody arrangements, and money matters, were but the ripple on the surface of a much deeper, more intimate upheaval. As Kody made his way to his appointed place, his thoughts whirled. He had prepared for questions about money, about property sales, about child support and custody arrangements. He had prepared for the public eye, for whisper campaigns, for speculative headlines, but nothing could possibly prepare a man for the emotional undertow, which would sweep the courtroom like a tide. He sensed the burden of his choices bearing down on him, the unseen eyes of his wives, the judge, the jury, and a nation of observers all upon him at once. The jury, sitting off to the side, watched in silence, but their presence was an added weight. These average citizens had been charged with extraordinary duty to balance the truth in the midst of a maelstrom of competing stories, to measure character against fact, and to finally render a judgment that would resonate far outside the courtroom doors. For them, it was not a spectacle, it was a sacred obligation, and its seriousness was palpable. Outside the courtroom, there was a crowd waiting, attracted by the polarizing power of high-profile drama. Fans and critics, and mere observers blended together, their tongues wagging in a chorus of judgment and speculation. Social media platforms were already aglow, the tale trending ahead of a single word being uttered within the courtroom. Every picture, every video clip, every live update fueled the swelling storm of public interest. And yet, in spite of the show, the real nature of what was transpiring within decades of complicated histories, the emotional tension of polygamy, the hardships and concessions of an offbeat family, lay concealed from sight, privy only to those who remained in the courtroom. Kody's mind drifted to his children, spread out in various homes, living a life partly defined by the choices and fights that were now being legally analyzed. He considered promises made, errors he had known in secret, but never publicly owned up to, and the expectation that somehow, perhaps justice in the courtroom, might exist side by side with family harmony, or at least some semblance of peace. The clerk rang the room to order. The judge lightly rapped the gavel, an indication that the proceedings would start. There was silence in the room like a thick curtain. Each individual leaned in a little, some adjusting chairs uncomfortably, others holding their breath, anticipating the initial words to shatter the charged balance. This was the moment that would shape the Brown family for decades to come. A moment when public opinion, personal anguish, and judicial scrutiny would converge in a theatrical spectacle unlike anything audiences had ever witnessed. As the judge stood to deliver his words, cameras snapped once more, flashes lighting up the stern faces of Kody and his wives. The world waited, holding its breath as the story began to unfold. At that moment, the courtroom was more than a space of law. It was a stage, a confessional, a battlefield, and a theater of human emotion. Every heartbeat, every look, every hushed conversation added to the script about to be written. A story that would mesmerize audiences, fill newspaper headlines, and add another page to the public Brown family saga. And in the middle of it all, Kody Brown sat poised but tense, knowing that today, nothing would be easy, nothing would be foreseeable, and nothing would exit the courtroom unscathed. The cameras flashed once more, the murmurs increased, and the doors to the courtroom shut behind the judge, the signal that the melodrama had begun officially. Kody Brown stood up slowly from his chair, each step cautious but weighed down by the burden of 2 decades of public scrutiny and internal family drama. The courtroom narrowed about him, the walls closing in as all eyes watched his every move. Cameras snapped, microphones leaned precariously close, and even the judge's serene stare appeared to drill straight through him, as if unspokenly demanding, "Are you prepared to confront the truth?" As he walked towards the witness stand, the atmosphere became nearly electric. Journalists hushed to one another, wondering what Kody would say, how he would explain years of choices that had been criticized by fans, critics, and even his own wives. The buzz of the crowd was a low, nearly undetectable hum, but it held the shared curiosity, judgment, and expectation of the entire room. Kody's hands shook a little as he made it to the stand, holding on to the edges to steady himself. It wasn't solely fear, although there was an abundance of that, but also the crushing burden of responsibility. He wasn't fighting only for himself. He was fighting for the decisions that had defined a whole family, for choices that had affected dozens of people, and for a legacy that the world had witnessed on screen for years. The pen of the court reporter scratched wildly across the pages, as Kody sat down, settling the microphone in front of him. "State your name for the record," the attorney started. Kody cleared his throat, his voice firm but with a hint of vulnerability that was seldom caught on camera. "Kody Brown," he replied, matter-of-factly, and the room seemed to pause. As if with a single word, lay the weight of an entire family's past. Questions followed rapidly, delving into all corners of his life and choices. The prosecution dived into charges of financial mismanagement, inquiring about real estate sales, secret accounts, and how he apportioned resources between his wives. Kody responded painstakingly, describing each transaction, every choice, every move with the clarity that came from preparation and necessity. Still, even as he spoke, the tension in the room hummed, each word picked over, each silence examined, each move deciphered as either truthful or false. The conversation turned quickly into a personal attack. The prosecutor posed direct questions concerning his relationships with each of the wives, probing the equity, communication, and balancing of family needs. Kody addressed love, commitment, and the difficulty of keeping the peace in a polygamous family. He spoke of the all-nighters mediating conflicts, of the economic stress of maintaining several households, of the emotional work of rearing dozens of children in different homes. His voice cracked on occasion, a raw and honest vulnerability that was an odd contrast to the calm, self-assured figure, familiar to the public. The courtroom crowd experienced the nuance of his life in increments as he spoke one after another. Robyn's eyes shone as she listened to him speak, possibly seeing the burden he had borne in silence. Janelle's lips compressed, her face impassive but her eyes revealing frustration and understanding. Christine fidgeted in her seat, divided between anger and hearing the realities that Kody was speaking. And Meri, always so silent, permitted a little sigh, as if even her decades of absence had been unable to protect her from the tempest that this testimony had rekindled. The defense lawyer led Kody through queries regarding his intentions, his sense of fairness, and his efforts to reconcile love and responsibility. Kody answered honestly, owning up to errors, conceding misunderstanding, and providing details of the tough decisions that had characterized his life. He spoke of times of war, times of sorrow, and times of victory, and he painted a portrait of a man who was not perfect, nor completely imperfect, but above all, deeply human. There was a moment when a string of questions reduced Kody to tears. He talked about his children, about birthdays lost, about fights intervened, about concessions made, and the courtroom collectively felt the pang of his sincerity. Some of the jurors leaned forward, their faces softening, others wrote notes frantically, capturing every detail. Even the judge's stern face seemed to crumple for a moment, as if acknowledging the seriousness of Kody's revelations. But the testimony was not merely that of vulnerability, but of strategy too. Kody spoke of the conscious choices he had made to support his family, to stand as one despite difference, and to shield his wives from outside judgment. He spoke of the innumerable times he had tried to reconcile competing demands, with failure and success, but always a determination to hold the family together. Every word, every statement, was a deliberate attempt at telling the truth while justifying a lifetime of difficult choices. Flashes of camera lights lit the room during the testimony, catching the looks that would soon fill social media and news reports. Each small movement, Kody's hands lightly placed on the stand, his look at Robyn for a fleeting moment, the tense silence in Janelle's stance, its own story, weaving layers onto a tale already filled with emotion and public intrigue. Cross-examination commenced, and the tension increased. The lawyer's questions were incisive, probing at times, nearly accusatory. Did you consider the financial burden on your wives? Were all the decisions openly made? How did you manage to resolve disputes that became personal? Kody replied with measured candor, admitting mistakes without discrediting his overall story. Each response, a careful balancing act, showing enough vulnerability to elicit sympathy, yet fending off accusations that might sway the scales of justice. Outside the courtroom, journalists whispered into microphones, reporting live. Social media exploded, followers arguing Kody's credibility, his motive, and whether or not the questions being asked were fair. In real time, the public was now included in the courtroom drama, their responses fueling the pressure and raising the stakes. Kody's testimony, as intimate as it was, had become a worldwide phenomenon, the boundary between private and public more blurred than ever. At the end of the session, Kody had unveiled layers of his existence, that few had even glimpsed. The courtroom, which was once abuzz with whispers and tension, had been transformed into a chamber of raw emotion, where vulnerability collided with scrutiny and honesty ran into doubt. Kody sat back down, worn out but determined, realizing that his testimony would have a long-lasting effect, far outside the courtroom doors, not just on the jury's verdict, but on the world's opinion of the Brown family. And as the judge adjourned briefly for a recess, the room hummed with speculation. Would Kody's truthfulness influence the jury? Would the reactions of his wives be a plus or a minus for credibility? And most of all, would the family come away whole? Or was this testimony merely the beginning of the fissure that no court verdict could heal? At that moment, Kody Brown sat with poise, fatigue, and humanity, the burden of his life and family weighing heavily upon his shoulders. The courtroom doors appeared diminutive now, the cameras deafening, and the whispers piercing, but one thing was certain: nothing about this day would ever be forgotten, and the world was witnessing every moment of it. The courtroom became all the more silent as the opening statements commenced. The lens of every camera appeared to center on Kody Brown and his family, recording every nuanced glance, every twitch of emotion, every micro-expression that could possibly suggest the tempest ready to unleash. The judge, high atop her bench, tapped her gavel, reminding decorum to be upheld, and every head instantly turned forward, focused on the lawyers who would soon script the story the jury and the world would hear. The prosecution stood first, with an intense, contained energy that instantly commanded respect. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the senior lawyer started, his voice sharp and resolute, ringing out across the hall without a note of uncertainty. "This is not just a case of money transactions or formalities. It is about integrity, trust, and accountability in a family that has been in the limelight for decades." He paused and allowed the words to linger in the air, sensing their weight falling into the minds of all those who were gathered. The choices of Kody Brown have affected several lives, not only within his family, but the larger community of individuals who had trusted and believed in them. Today we will lay bare the foundations, layer by layer, revealing how mismanagement, favoritism, and a lack of regard for fairness have brought about irreparable harm. The courtroom was hushed, save for the sporadic click of a camera, recording reactions from both the crowd and Brown family members. Robyn's hands were clutched in her lap, knuckles white as she listened. Janelle moved slightly, lips clamped tight, betraying inner turmoil of curiosity and concern. Christine's eyes contracted, the tension in her jaw, as Meri stood firm but palpably strained, her fingers clasped together as she steeled herself for what was to be revealed. The defense attorney then stood up, serene and unruffled, a marked contrast to the fervor of the prosecution. She fiddled with her notes, took a moment to lock eyes with the jury, and proceeded to speak with measured, compelling tones. "Members of the jury," she started, "Kody Brown is a man who has spent his lifetime committing himself to his family, working to bring stability, love, and direction in circumstances that few could even dream of. This family's life has been open, one that has been criticized in ways that are unequal and invasive. What you will witness in this test case are not acts of malice or dishonesty, but the tough decisions of a man attempting to juggle several burdens, keep the peace, and take care of the people he loves." The defense lawyer strolled slowly before the jury, locking eyes with a few of them, projecting sincerity and credibility. "You will hear allegations, accusations, and interpretations of what took place," she went on. "But it is your responsibility to distinguish opinion from fact, assumption from fact. Kody's life has been complex, yes, but his intentions, his work, and his actions are motivated by love, devotion, and an unshakable commitment to the well-being of his family." Even as the lawyers addressed the court, the room was a pressure cooker, the tension palpable. Every guest in the audience was leaning forward, some clutching their chairs, others poised for breath. Outside, social media already was buzzing with gossip, live streams debating every detail, every move, every tone of voice. The opening arguments had laid out the ground for a war of stories: fact versus interpretation, emotion versus law, public opinion versus personal truth. The prosecution presented a dramatic chronology of events, including property sales, supposed financial imbalances, and arguments over child support and domestic administration. They highlighted instances where decisions had been taken behind closed doors, without the agreement of all members, presenting these as evidence of favoritism and dereliction of duty. Every statement was planned to the letter to appeal to both reason and emotion, to cause the jury not only to look at numbers and contracts, but also the human consequence of these choices. The defense responded with personal stories of long nights spent arbitrating disputes, sacrifices to care for each wife and child, and attempts to hold the family together despite the never-ending public eye. They created an image of a man who, though flawed, had done so with good motives, trying to make sense of an astoundingly complicated family arrangement while having the well-being of all parties at the forefront. As the lawyers talked, Kody sat fixedly, his eyes occasionally wandering to each of his wives. He could sense the judging glances, the wishes and the fears coming from them. Robyn's eye was steadfast and encouraging, a calm steady in the midst of the tempest. Janelle's face showed a mixture of reservation and inquiry, as if measuring every utterance against her own life. Christine's eyes were sharp, analyzing every detail, searching for contradictions, while Meri's calm exterior masked a whirlwind of memories, emotions, and reflections. The opening remarks also highlighted the stakes of the trial. The prosecution emphasized the legal and financial ramifications, telling the jury that the verdict could establish a precedent for holding non-traditional family members accountable. The defense emphasized the personal and emotional repercussions, reminding the jury that behind the ledgers and contracts were flesh and blood people, emotions and decades of commitment that couldn't be quantified in terms of money or paper. For the crowd, both within the courtroom and on the internet, the atmosphere was charged. The story being constructed for their benefit was something greater than a legal struggle. It was a human drama, a tale of devotion, strife, love, and treachery that had played out for decades, and was now condensed into hours of evidence and debate. Each pause, each inflection, each little movement was integrated into the greater story, weaving layers into the tale that cameras could see but never fully detail. Before both lawyers finished their opening arguments, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The ground had been laid. Two rival visions of reality, each one trying to get the jury to believe, each of which commanded that notice be taken of the decisions, actions, and motivations of a man who'd lived anything but a normal life. The judge declared a brief recess before the first witnesses were presented, allowing everyone a minute to process the seriousness of what had been set before them. During the recess, hushed murmurs swept through the courtroom. Journalists speculated about whose story would be more compelling. Members of the audience argued who appeared more believable, and social media sites blew up with real-time analysis. The opening arguments hadn't merely set out the legal claims. They had set out the emotional stakes, the human cost, and the public interest that had shadowed the Brown family for decades. And as Kody reclined, collecting himself and steeling himself for the witnesses soon to appear on the stand, he knew that the fight on hand would be as much about emotion and perception as it would be about facts and evidence. Each word, each tale, each testimony would further compound a tale the world was breathlessly watching, and there was no going back. The courtroom was staged now, the jury was the audience, and Kody Brown was both the hero and the accused in a tale that was about to be staged in ways that no one could possibly anticipate. The opening speeches had created the backdrop, but the true drama, the human drama, the emotional drama, the dramatic disclosures had yet to come. The courtroom hushed as the proof was presented, and for a second it seemed as if even the air suspended its breath. A huge screen came to life, casting a pale, cold light over the room. Charts, bank statements, emails, and contracts came out one at a time, each a piece of a puzzle that had intrigued the public for months. Reporters craned forward in their seats, cameras focusing on the documents, and the jurors looked at each other, sensing the weight of what they were about to dissect. Kody Brown observed intently as the prosecution started their presentation. Every shred of evidence was carefully put on display, followed by a timeline meant to illustrate years of purported mismanagement. Sales of property, money transfers, and disputed loans were displayed with accuracy, each figure carefully chosen to reflect trends of favoritism and questionable discretion. Gasps came from the public gallery as vast amounts of money were unveiled, accounts that the prosecution alleged should have been opened but were kept hidden. One document attracted special notice: a meticulously detailed ledger recording the sale of several family properties across many years. Some wives had been paid unequal shares of proceeds, the prosecution alleged, fueling arguments within the family that had apparently grown into entrenched bitterness. The attorney steering the evidence indicated lines of text, specifying dates, figures, and signatures, or occasionally their omission. "These are not statistics," the lawyer continued, voice rising a notch. "These are broken trust, unseen sacrifices, and choices that were made without equity." The defense was quick to respond, summoning an expert to testify about how sophisticated financial dealings might readily seem deceptive to one who was not familiar with the nuances of accounting procedures. These accounts might have been misread, altered by computers, or even fabricated, the expert testified serenely, practically unnervingly calm in the tense environment of the courtroom. The jury listened carefully, some nodding slightly, others furrowing their brows, attempting to balance the dueling narratives before them. Emails followed, highlighted in bold and printed. They included exchanges between Kody and his wives over big decisions, property acquisitions, household budgeting, and even children's education. Each email, painstakingly constructed by the prosecution, was designed to display a pecking order of influence. Assertions that Kody preferred some wives to others. Certain phrases appeared benign in isolation, but against the background they were uttered in, implied disparity, strain, and the subliminal presence of discontent, which had allegedly been present for decades. Witnesses were summoned to support the financial documentation. A past family aide provided testimony regarding overheard dialogue and arguments regarding finances, recounting instances in which specific wives purportedly felt omitted. The courtroom responded visibly at times, husky gasps of astonishment, soft-spoken questions, and the occasional whispered gasp as intimate details became apparent. Kody remained calm, but the faintest of jaw clenches, and the occasional flicker of his gaze betrayed the tension he experienced under the constant invasion. The emotional level was sharply raised when a mother of one of Kody's children testified to the effect of financial choices on the day-to-day. She testified of school fees held up, medical bills hard to pay, and home needs often pitted against one another for scarce resources. Her voice broke, and she faltered, overcome with emotion, as the financial difficulties of the family became irrefutable. To many in the courtroom, this was no longer merely a legal issue. It was intensely human, excruciatingly relatable, and emotionally compelling. Even Kody's own account of what happened was included in the evidence presentation. He explained the rationale behind each decision, stating that some of the transactions had been done to stabilize the family unit overall, even if they presented short-term inconvenience to individual members. He talked of keeping long-term goals in mind, attempting to keep things harmonious, and making sure each child had the right to an education and stability. The sincerity of his words rang out, but it was quickly countered by the prosecution, who drew attention to discrepancies, timelines, and seeming omissions. Visual aids provided another level of force. Income versus expense charts, timelines of real estate sales, and flow charts of monetary exchanges were displayed on a courtroom screen, breaking down the daunting numbers and choices into much more accessible versions for the jury and audience to swallow. The presentation was deliberate, almost filmic, turning the courtroom into a theater of logic, figures, and emotional investment entwined. By the time the last piece of evidence was presented, the room was charged with electricity. It was a set of financial reports and personal letters that appeared to summarize the whole fight: the tug and pull of power, the unseen tensions of balancing a polygamous family, and the emotional backlash of choices under stress. The prosecutor's tone turned stern, stressing that this proof presented a picture of imbalance and favoritism. The defense pushed back, pointing out to everyone that context, intention, and circumstance were key factors in comprehending the real story. Kody's wives, sitting in their respective sections, were visibly shaken. Robyn's expression was calm, but her fingers drummed impatiently on her lap. Janelle's eyes tracked every chart, email, and document, her face a mask of incredulity, mixed with scrutiny. Christine leaned forward, her eyes taking in each point of detail with piercing focus, while Meri looked contemplative, sorting through years of intimate history, reduced to numbers and words presented before all of them. Even the judge appeared to feel the gravity of the moment. She watched impassively, with now and then a glance at the attorneys or the jury, making certain the attention stayed with the evidence, not theatrics. The gavel lay athwart her desk, a reminder that in the end, the ruling would not be based on feeling, but on fact, clarity, and legal interpretation. At the end of the session, the jury had heard a cascade of evidence, some of it shocking, some of it illuminating, all challenging the limits of memory, perception, and truth. Cameras kept flashing, reporters murmured in hushed tones, and social media feeds were already lit up with responses. Headlines would come later to proclaim the explosive evidence and shocking revelations of the trial. But at that time, the courtroom hummed with tension, every eye, every mind, and every heart waiting for the next step in the drama. Witness testimony that threatened to bring layers of individual emotion, insight, and conflict. Kody went back to his seat, exhaling slowly, feeling the burden of the attention, as well as the peculiar relief that at least the facts, numbers, papers, and emails were finally out in the open. The tale was still far from being complete. The evidence had stunned the courtroom, but it was merely the groundwork on which the drama of emotions, memories, and personal truths would be constructed in the succeeding hours. The courtroom was thick with expectation as the initial witnesses were brought into the witness stand. All eyes in the room, jury, judge, Kody, his wives, and the crowd were glued to the drama that was unraveling. This was no longer about figures, graphs, or legalities. This was about humanity, human experience, and the unadorned truth of decades-long family life. The air was charged almost to the point of electricity, as if the room itself recognized that what was to be disclosed had the potential to rattle the Brown family to its core. The first witness was a mother whose existence had been significantly affected by Kody's spending choices. She walked to the stand hesitantly, her footsteps reluctant but firm. Her voice, when speaking, shook a little, burdened by the seriousness of what she was saying. "I left decisions to Kody to ensure my family was safe," she said, fighting to maintain composure as tears rose to the surface of her eyes. "But too many times, we were scrambling. School tuition, medical expenses, the necessities of life, we had to fight for what was ours." The courtroom was silent, every sentence dropping into the heads of all in attendance. Even the jury appeared to lean forward, sensing the human interest behind the evidence already given. Kody shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching around the edge of the bench. He had prepared for financial examination, public opinion, and legal cross-examination. But hearing the emotional implications expressed aloud was a different matter altogether. He glanced over at his wives. Robyn's hand lay lightly on hers, a discreet gesture of support. Janelle's gaze was intense, almost searching, as if weighing the testimony against her own memories. Christine's face remained guarded, but her eyes betrayed the stirrings of empathy, and Meri's quiet composure suggested an inner reckoning with past grievances. Next came Kody's colleagues and assistants, called as witnesses for the defense. They told a different story, one of a man who worked ceaselessly to keep peace throughout a household that most people could hardly envision. "Kody stayed up countless nights mediating conflicts," testified one. "He made sure that every wife and child had what they needed, even if it wasn't easy. His choices were never taken lightly." Their steady, deliberate voices echoed starkly against the emotional rawness of earlier testimony, establishing a dynamic tension in the room that left every listener wired on edge. Then the questioning came directly to Kody's wives, each in turn. First was Christine. She answered with deliberate clarity, speaking of moments of frustration and disappointment, but also of moments of cooperation and mutual respect. "I loved my family," she whispered, "but there were moments that I felt ignored, unheard, and occasionally betrayed. I didn't know why certain choices were made without discussing them with me." Her voice was laced with emotional gravity that filled the room, each word underscoring the humanity of a courtroom fight. Janelle testified more bluntly, an interplay of sadness and understated accusation. She told of arguments that mounted over the years, of monetary and emotional decisions that caused tension and resentment, and of the ongoing work needed to keep life in balance in a complicated home. "We all loved Kody," she said. "But love doesn't eliminate the consequences of bad choices. And sometimes, those repercussions don't just hit one wife, but the entire family." Her words seemed to resonate as they spilled through the courtroom, and some responded with murmurs of compassion and others with nods of recognition. Robyn went next. Her voice was strong but laced with worry. She described her attempts to mediate disputes, to support her co-wives, and to maintain a semblance of unity within a household often fraught with tension. "I've always tried to be fair," she said. "But fairness is complicated in a family like ours. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, feelings get hurt and trust is tested." Her honesty combined with her composure seemed to give the jury pause, challenging them to consider the difficulty of maintaining harmony in such an unconventional family structure. Meri's testimony was quiet but profoundly impactful. She recounted her experiences of divorce, separation, and navigating life outside of the immediate family unit. Even though her voice was quiet, every word carried a weight, emphasizing the cost of living in part in public and in part in private. "I still love my family," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "But some wounds are deep, and some things, however much we struggle to mend, just can't be repaired by apology." Her words hung in the air, a humid reminder of the human price tag on the courtroom fight. As each witness testified, the courtroom became a forum of naked emotion, introspection, and implicit confrontation. The jury heard attentively, their faces changing from interest to compassion, from skepticism to comprehension. Even the media, hardened to those headlines that broadcast cries of foul play, stood frozen for a moment, enthralled by the profoundly human stories being told. The tension between fact and feeling, between legal inquiry and individual truth, hung in every part of the room. Cross-examinations also added to the drama. Lawyers questioned recollections, motives, and inconsistencies in testimony. But even when pressed, the witnesses did not budge, sharing observations that went beyond spreadsheets and agreements, revealing the people affected by decisions, miscommunications, and entrenched animosities. Every question, every answer added a new layer of depth to the story, so that the jury and the public could see that this was not just a numbers game, but a tale of love, conflict, sacrifice, and determination. At the end of the session, the emotional charge in the courtroom was almost palpable. Jurors sat in silence, taking in the testimonies and considering the complex dynamics they had just seen unfold. Kody reclined slightly, spent but firm, knowing that the testimonies had made him human, even while they exposed the failures and pitfalls that had led the family to this moment. As the courtroom took a short recess, the air was filled with whispers. Journalists predicted which statements would have the highest impact. Social media timelines erupted with live commentary, and international viewers discussed the emotional and factual strengths of every utterance. The Brown family drama had moved beyond reality TV. It had evolved into a compelling, emotionally charged courtroom drama that could not be missed. And yet, even with the high emotion, the tale was hardly finished. The depositions had uncovered the essence of the family's plight, but the subsequent stages, cross-examinations, expert testimony, and the final closing statements, would decide how this story would be read, balanced, and ultimately decided. For the time being, the courtroom had seen the humanity of Kody Brown and his wives, a humanity that legal documents and numbers and contracts could never completely contain. The courtroom was stuck in reverse as the cross-examinations commenced, the tension becoming almost charged. The defense lawyers stood up, a measured composure in their gestures which was starkly juxtaposed against the previous emotional depositions. Every witness who had spoken now faced pointed, strategic questioning designed to challenge recollections, motives, and credibility. The subtle tension that had been building for days now reached a fever pitch, as if the room itself was bracing for the storm about to erupt. The first witness, a career family aide, squirmed uncomfortably under the probing of the defense. Answers were deliberate, nearly surgical. "Can you verify the specific dates of these transactions?" the attorney inquired, voice firm but pointed. "Are you certain beyond all doubt these discussions took place as you stated?" The witness stumbled, hesitated, and shot nervous glances at the jury. Even slight inconsistencies, readily dismissed in friendly conversation, now loomed large under the relentless spotlight of courtroom questioning. Kody edged forward in his seat, eyes locked on the witness, a combination of fear and silent hope. He knew the potential of cross-examination. It had the ability to tear down artfully crafted accounts and expose chinks in perception. The defense attorney's voice was measured but merciless, compelling the witness to acknowledge the boundaries of remembrance and interpretation. The courtroom breathed as one, waiting as seemingly solid depositions started to crack. The attention then turned to Kody's wives, each being asked questions that picked apart the very essence of what they had previously said. Christine was put to the test, as she was questioned about particular events she had described. "Are you sure of the events in the correct order?" the lawyer queried. "May your sense of fairness be biased by emotion and not objective truth." She narrowed her gaze slightly, her jaw clenched. She replied with guarded exactness, but with tactful hesitation, betraying that even firmly held beliefs were vulnerable to disproof under the pressure of examination. Janelle's cross-examination was especially fierce. The defense lawyer pointed out possible inconsistencies in her statement, highlighting dates, emails, and past interviews. "You made one statement on a TV interview, and another a little different here. Which is true?" The question was straightforward-looking, but had gigantic consequences. "The pressure depressions party. Human in being twos." Janelle hesitated, clearly weighing her words, knowing that each utterance might serve to solidify her credibility or undermine it. The jury leaned forward, feeling the tide of the case turn with each measured response. Robyn also was asked pointed questions regarding her own participation in family decision-making. The defense lawyer questioned her regarding precise financial decisions, efforts to resolve conflicts, and what she meant by fairness in the home. Is it possible that some misunderstandings could have arisen from miscommunication, rather than malice? The question struck at the heart of the testimony, reframing previous emotional statements into matters of perspective and perception. Robyn's answers were measured, thoughtful, and calm, showing both her insight and her awareness of how her words might influence the jury. Meri's testimony, quiet yet piercing, was next. The defense focused on her accounts of separation and emotional strain, questioning whether her perceptions were influenced by personal experiences outside the household. "Could some of your recollections be affected by time or personal feelings?" the attorney asked gently. Meri's eyes flickered, reflecting a mix of sorrow, frustration, and clarity. She responded carefully, acknowledging the influence of emotions while standing firm on the truths she had experienced firsthand. The thin line between honesty and interpretation introduced an element of complexity that rendered the jury's role even more difficult. As the cross-examinations went on, the courtroom turned into a chessboard of strategy, observation, and psychological play. The lawyers moved with caution, aware that one misstep, or one poorly worded response, would shift perception radically. The jury, well versed in these dynamics, leaned forward, their focus unflagging. They watched not only what each testimony said, but the subtleties, the pauses, the inflections, the glances exchanged, and the unspoken tension that filled the air. Kody himself watched silently, taking in every second. He knew what was at stake. The cross-examinations were not just meant to refute testimony, but to lay bare the gaps, inconsistencies, and emotional prejudices, which necessarily inhered in so complicated a family situation. He knew the truth of his motivations, and the facts of running a polygamous home, but now it was left to perception, jury perception, legal interpretation, public opinion, to decide how that truth was to be balanced. The passion in the air was electric. At one moment, a witness's voice trembled under sustained questioning, garnering sympathetic looks from the crowd. At another, a nicely crafted challenge uncovered a small inconsistency, causing murmurs of uncertainty to ripple unobtrusively through the atmosphere. The courtroom buzzed with tension, as if every phrase, every hesitation, and every look had repercussions extending far beyond the current minute. By the end of the session, it was evident that the cross-examinations had dramatically changed the story. Testimonies that had originally appeared so simple were now contextualized with nuance, subjectivity, and interpretation. The emotional appeal of the prosecution had been met with calculated challenges, revealing the intricacies of family life, human memory, and individual perception. Cameras blazed continuously as the witnesses left the stand, the courtroom abuzz with tension and speculation over how these confrontations would affect the jury's ultimate decision. Social media went wild outside. Fans speculated about whose advantage would prevail, analyzing every micro-expression, every pause, and every studiously crafted word. Headlines foretold dramatic turns and courtroom bombshells that would dominate news coverage for days. For the Browns, the cross-examinations had turned the trial into something more than legal procedure. They had turned it into a stage of human nuance, perception, and emotion, a tale that engulfed the country and demanded viewers wrestle with the truth behind the public facade. Kody sat back down, tired but focused, knowing that the cross-examinations had both pushed and unveiled the mettle of his family. As tension still ran high, one thing could not be denied. The jury had now seen not only the case facts, but the delicate interplay of emotion, intent, and point of view that characterized the Brown family's complicated world. The courtroom, for a fleeting instant, was a stage where human drama collided with legal analysis in its most basic, compelling incarnation. And even as the gavel rang out announcing a brief recess, the room was still electric with expectation. Everyone knew that the fight was not yet finished. The next sessions would see expert testimony, additional evidence, and final arguments that could well decide. But for the moment, the cross-examinations had already made their mark, revealing the layers, contradictions, and deep humanity at the core of this remarkable case. The courtroom was in a state of feverish anticipation. Each hushed exchange, each slight movement, and each flash of a camera seemed magnified by the electric atmosphere. The jury strained forward, determined to catch each shade of expression, each hesitation, each pause. Kody Brown sat stiff in his chair, his thoughts racing through the maze of testimonies, proofs, and cross-questionings that had filled the morning. His wife stood statue-like, but charged emotionally, each silently struggling with her own thoughts and recollections. In the heavy tension, the presence of the judge grew even more authoritative. She inclined slightly forward in her bench, her gaze raking the room with a keen, unyielding intensity. The gavel lay in front of her like a quiet watchman, ready to impose order. Then, with a measured tone that sliced across the hum of the room like a blade, she intoned order in the courtroom. The ring of the gavel echoed throughout the room, stilled every voice. Reporters fussed with their microphones, jurors squirmed in their seats, and Kody's wives involuntarily stiffened in their seats. The judge's eyes, sharp and unrelenting, swept deliberately around the room, transmitting an unmistakable message. The law, respect, and reality would preside over these proceedings, not sentiment, showmanship, or popularity. I do know that this case has taken widespread attention. The judge went on, her voice authoritative but equitable. The cameras, reporters, and the public can increase tension, speculation, and interpretation. But let me be clear, this is a court of justice, not gossip, not drama, and not public spectacle. There was a silence in the room. Even the journalists hesitated, jotting notes under their breath and dipping cameras for a brief moment to allow herself into the gravity of what she said. The warning of the judge was not procedural alone. It was a suggestion that in the midst of human feeling, the public fascination, and personal interests, the court required attention, order, and justice first and foremost. Everyone present has a part to play in upholding the integrity of these proceedings, added the judge. Witnesses, family members, lawyers, jury, and media are all included. Any effort to manipulate perception, divert, or sensationalize will not be countenanced. The court will make sure that justice is not overshadowed by spectacle. The blunt reprimand acted at once. Kody breathed slowly, relief and new fear swirling in him. The understanding that the courtroom was a place where truth, not performance, reigned permitted him a fleeting moment of insight. But the seriousness of the trial pressed down on him. The warning highlighted how much rode on it. Legally, but emotionally, financially, and societally as well. The judge's eyes rested for a moment on Kody's wives. "You two are to behave with respect and dignity," she stated. "Although your emotions, complaints, and experiences are at the heart of this case, they should be appropriately conveyed within the limits of truthfulness and modesty. Gesticulations, tantrums, or personal insults will not advance the quest for truth." Robyn's hands curled tightly in her lap. Janelle glanced nervously at Kody, silently seeking reassurance. Christine's jaw tightened, a look of defiance and recognition flashing through her face. And Meri, serene but clearly introspective, nodded once, seeing the underlying power the judge had just claimed. The gavel struck once more softly, highlighting the judge's last comment. "Remember, members of the jury, your duty is to separate fact from feeling, truth from impression. Your attention must be on evidence, testimony, and law, not public opinion, media rumor, or personal prejudice." Outside the courtroom, its effect would echo via social media, live streaming, and news coverage. Headlines would subsequently cite her firm reminder that the courtroom is a temple of truth, not the theater of drama. But within the chamber, its effect was instant. The tension shifted somewhat from emotion, raw and unbridled, to heightened awareness of obligation, gravity, and intensity. Kody looked out at the jury, saw the leaning forward, the pens held ready, the awakened eyes. He knew the unspoken message. The choices here would not be based on who had cried the hardest or appeared most sympathetic, but on measured, deliberate consideration of facts, credibility, and context. The session went on in this newly charged environment. The returned witnesses now appeared more composed, their speech firm, their movements restrained. Lawyers, knowing the judge's admonition, toned down their delivery and style, alternating between passion and professionalism. Even the public, the press, and the wives subtly adjusted, keeping their behavior in check as the legal process went on in a heightened seriousness. But even with the serenity imposed by the judge, the tension that lay just beneath the surface was still palpable. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, and each look shared between Kody and his wives had a live wire of an electric tension. The warning did not mute the drama. It refined it, concentrated it, and sharpened it, reminding everyone that seeking justice demanded discipline as much as truth. By the conclusion of the session, it was apparent that the stern words of the judge had made their mark. The courtroom, though still laden with emotion, functioned with a new sense of purpose. The jury, intent and watchful, appeared more ready to consider the evidence carefully. Kody breathed again, this time with a sense of resolve. The fight was hardly over, but the rules were now clear, and the route ahead was unambiguous. As the courtroom adjourned, murmurs spread throughout the gallery. Journalists wondered how the warning from the judge would affect future testimony and deliberation. Fans argued the implications in cyberspace, dissecting the tone of the judge, her motive, and what it presaged for the Brown family drama. Behind closed doors, Kody and his wives had a silent consensus. The emotional and legal battles to come would be tough, but the court's sanction and the search for truth would preserve the course. The drama was by no means ended. The warning had established limits, but it also raised the stakes, reminding everyone that each choice, each piece of testimony, and each response would be examined with exacting scrutiny. The Brown family's narrative, once more, hung in balance between public interest, private openness, and the dispassionate eye of justice. The courtroom gradually emptied, leaving only the aftertension of days of testimony, exhibits, and emotional clashes. Cameras snapped as reporters shouldered their equipment, whispers of rumor filling the air. But in the jury room, a tempest of another kind was brewing. Behind the closed doors of a San Marino hotel room, 12 average citizens were given the extraordinary task of balancing all the evidence, all the testimony, all the twists and turns of the Brown family drama. They would decide the fate of a trial that had held the nation enthralled. As the jury entered the deliberation room, the air was heavy with expectation. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a composed but firm presence, took charge, structuring the discussion. "Let's work through everything we've heard," she said, voice calm but authoritative. We have to sort out fact from feeling, evidence from opinion. This is a complicated case, and we have to be meticulous. The jurors looked at one another, some frowning, some thoughtful, as they set about sorting out the hours of testimony. Each of the witnesses had made a different impression. Kody's measured truthfulness, the wives' tearful description of their lives, the assistant's inside knowledge of family life, and the expert witness's elucidation of financial complexities. They argued fiercely, sometimes in accord, sometimes in opposition, as they attempted to construct a coherent picture. One of the jurors, a young man with keen analytical mind, indicated the financial records. "See these transactions," he said, tapping a printed sheet. In theory, some of these choices favored one wife over the other. But context counts. Kody defined these as long-term planning decisions to solidify the whole family. Another juror nodded considerately. Yes, but even when intentions were good, the results still caused tension and struggle. We can't disregard the emotional effect on the family members. The conversation soon turned into a precarious dance between reason and sympathy. Jurors argued over whether emotional testimonies were applicable as compared to written records. Some believed that the personal narratives uncovered patterns of favoritism, neglect, or misunderstanding. Others insisted that Kody's motive, his years of commitment, and the natural ambiguity of sustaining multiple homes could not be dismissed. The room hummed with subdued intensity, as each juror gave all words, all numbers, all little movements they witnessed at trial their deliberations due consideration. With the hours ticking by, tensions grew, disagreements in viewpoint emerged, echoing the larger social debate about the Brown family. There were jurors who asked if non-traditional families were more prone to conflict, and if that was something that should be considered in judgment. There were others who believed that personal bias should not come into play in legal proceedings. The evidence, testimony, and credibility alone should inform their verdict. In between breaks, jurors pored over notes, timelines, and critical pieces of evidence in private contemplation. The emotional testimony of Kody's wives carried great weight with many of them, emphasizing the human face behind the monetary differences. Jurors argued over what importance to assign to these emotional testimonies as opposed to concrete evidence presented. The room was a mirror image of the courtroom itself, tense, having rival interpretations and bearing responsibility. The four women led the discussion carefully, making sure that all jurors had a chance to be heard. "We have to think about intent and outcome," she reminded them. Kody certainly made errors, but was he acting with ill will, or was he attempting to handle a difficult situation? This point of contention was the focus of most discussions, causing jurors to go back and reconsider testimony, read over documents, and study the subtlety of each word that was spoken during the trial. Hours became a day of deliberation. Jurors rehashed each of the witnesses, cross-checked statements, and argued over opposing meanings. They pored over Kody's accounts, the money evidence, the wives' emotional statements, and even the judge's warnings about decorum and credibility. Patterns began to emerge, inconsistencies were detected, and views changed. Deliberation was not just a matter of right or wrong. It was a matter of comprehending complexity, interpreting motives, and reconciling justice with compassion. The gravity of their responsibility was evident. Every juror was aware that the outcome of their decision would not only influence the legal process, but also the Brown family's lives and the sentiment of the public. They could not help but realize that millions of people were following, that already social media had made judgments, and that metaphorically in the room with them were the nation's eyes. In spite of this pressure, they concentrated on the facts, the law, and the credibility of witnesses, understanding that their responsibility was to the process, and not to the spectacle. As the sun began to set through the blinds, the jurors edged their way towards concurrence with trepidation. Concurrences were tentative, compromises were proposed, and ultimate decisions were considered with careful deliberation. Each juror experienced bouts of uncertainty, introspection, and ethical questioning, aware of the heavy burden carried on their shoulders. The deliberation was an exercise not merely in judgment, but in empathy, critical thinking, and grasping human nuance. When the four-person requested a final vote, the room was filled with tension and determination. Each juror voted quietly but purposefully, knowing that the result would end a chapter of public glare, personal suffering, and courtroom struggle that had consumed the Brown family for months. The decision, when finally rendered, would not be simply a legal finding. It would be the essence of emotion, fact, and interpretation, and it would reverberate far beyond the confines of the courtroom. As the jury exited to render their verdict, the courtroom prepared itself. Kody Brown sat upright, his hands tightly clasped, eyes locked on the jury box. His wives looked at one another, each reflecting on the months of tension, testimony, and revelation that had built up to this moment. The judge's gavel hung in wait, cameras stood poised, and the world held its collective breath. The Brown family's story, with all its intricacy, emotion, and public interest, was soon to reach a turning point. Each of the jurors, each of the bits of evidence, and each of the testimonies had led to this. The decision was not only a verdict, it was an indication of where human nuance, intent, and feeling met law, justice, and public examination. The room was held in stillness as the jury emerged, the anticipation so heavy it had almost a physical presence. All the seats appeared to groan beneath the weight of expectation, and all the eyes watched the jurors move back into the room with bated breath. Kody Brown sat upright, hands clasped tightly in his lap, jaw tense, and eyes fixed on the foreperson leading the jury. His wives exchanged anxious glances. Robyn's fingers twisted nervously, Janelle's lips pressed into a thin line, Christine's eyes narrowed in focus, and Meri's calm exterior betrayed a flicker of worry. The judge pushed her glasses up her nose, leaning forward a bit, and tapped the gavel lightly. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she said firmly, but politely. The foreperson stood up, her expression a blend of determination and apprehension, and replied clearly, "We have, Your Honor." A silence settled in the courtroom. Reporters caught their breath behind their cameras, jury members themselves seemed strained, and even Kody appeared to take a slow, heavy breath, as if steeling himself for impact. The room hung in a moment that was both infinite and instantaneous, where each beat of their hearts and rustle of movement seemed amplified. The foreperson went on. "We, the jury, find the defendant," and then hesitated. Whispers burst through the room, eyes wide with anticipation. Each second of pause heightened the tension. Kody's grip around his lap grew tighter. Robyn's knuckles blanched. The world outside paused, waiting on the cusp of discovery. "Guilty of some charges, but not all," the foreperson finished. The words struck the courtroom like a clap of thunder. Gasp-inducing gasps, murmurs, and screams outburst forth at once. Cameras snapped wildly. Reporters yelled out questions, and Twitter feeds burst forth with live updates as the historic moment was recorded in real time. Kody's face turned pale, a blend of shock, incredulity, and determination passing over his face. He knew the stakes were high, but this partial verdict was a twist he had not anticipated. A relief and a crushing disappointment. The courtroom swirled, everything heightened in the increased tension. The judge's hard stare, the jury's deliberate faces, the wives' emotional outbursts. Robyn leaned slightly toward him, whispering words of reassurance, though her own eyes glistened with emotion. Janelle's lips quivered, her gaze fixed on Kody as if seeking clarity in the chaos. Christine's expression was unreadable, a careful mask hiding a storm of thoughts, while Meri's quiet composure provided a subtle anchor amidst the turbulence. The courtroom was ordered to session by the judge, her gavel piercing the tumult. "The verdict has been entered. The court will now set sentencing and additional proceedings as required." Her tone was crisp with authority, but it did nothing to dampen the emotional value in the room. The verdict, in its partway form, had already created the groundwork for continuing drama, public speculation, and media hype. Outside the courtroom, the global reaction was immediate. Social media blew up with popular hashtags. Fans argued over the justice of the verdict. Kody's supporters rationalized his acquittal, and those critical of him pointed to the guilty verdicts. In dramatic headlines splashed across websites, "Kody Brown verdict stuns fans across the globe," and "Courtroom suspense hits a fever as Brown family receives partial verdict." The public interest in the family's trials, both personal and legal, had never been higher. Within the courtroom, Kody's mind whirled. He went over the testimonies, the evidence, and the cross-examinations. Part of the verdict coincided with his fears. affirming the setbacks and mistakes he had expected. But other parts gave him relief, affirming the actions he had taken to protect and care for his wives and children. The ambivalence of the verdict reflected the multifaceted nature of his life, a blend of victories and defeats, love and strife, truth and perception. The partial verdict also created tension among the family. Talks that were once confidential now became impossible to avoid under public and judicial scrutiny. Kody's wives looked at each other with questions in their eyes, unvoiced worries, and memories of their collective past. The courtroom, which used to be a stage for evidence and testimony, had turned into a crucible that exposed both the resilience and fragility of the Brown family dynamic. As the jurors left, the weight of the moment hung over all of them. Kody sat back, collected but clearly spent, knowing that the verdict was just one installment in an ongoing drama. Outside the courtroom, reporters rushed for cameras, Twitter blew up, and onlookers across the globe argued, talked, and analyzed every nuance. The Brown family's story, already public, had now entered a new, even more compelling phase, one where the consequences of the courtroom's judgment would ripple through every aspect of their lives. The session was adjourned by the judge, her gavel ringing a sound that was one of finality, yet also of continuation. Kody and the wives of his reconstructed household collected themselves, knowing that though today's decision stunned the globe, the tale was hardly finished. Appeals in the courts, public outcry, and familial healing would occur, so the saga of the Brown family would continue to engage fans, provoke discussion, and lay bare the complexities of human relationships in the most trying of situations. In that courtroom, in that fraught instant, the verdict meant more than an official ruling. It was an echo of decades of decisions, sacrifice, conflict, and love. It was a moment to be remembered, analyzed and retold, a turning point in a tale which the world had sat and watched unfold with paralyzing fascination. For Kody Brown and his wives, it was a challenge, and an opportunity, a possibility to confront the aftermath, to rebuild, and to face the reality of having lived a life in the public eye, under the microscope of public scrutiny, and within the complicated web of family loyalty and discord. The courtroom had cleared, leaving but the lingering echoes of the verdict. Cameras were stowed away, newsmen muttered last-minute details, and social media sites overflowed with comments, arguments, and popular hashtags. Outside, the world buzzed with opinions, speculation, and indignation, but within, the Brown family had to contend with a less sensational but more inner-focused challenge: the consequences of a choice that had altered their lives indefinitely. Kody Brown ambled from the courthouse, his gait slow, each step weighed with the consideration of thought. He had endured the harsh glare of the courtroom, weathered the emotional testimonies, and grappled with the astonishing verdict. Now, standing in open air, he could sense both the sense of relief of proceedings finished, and the weight of consequences to be borne. The sun cast shadows over the plaza, a dramatic reminder that even though the storm had passed, life went on, complicated, unpredictable, and human. Robyn trailed behind, her hand touching his lightly, providing silent encouragement. Her face was a blend of fatigue and comfort. They had been through it all together, not only a courtroom, but decades of family life under pressure with the public spotlight. She murmured a few words, gentle yet earthy, reminding him that no matter what the verdict would be, their family could survive, rebuild, and carry on. Janelle, Christine, and Meri walked alongside them, each contemplating the moment in her own manner. Janelle's gaze spoke of the burden of doubt, yet quietly of determination as well. Christine's stance was guarded, but reflective, indicating a combination of thought and deliberate planning for the future steps. Meri, eternally serene, seemed to take the moment in silently, her tranquil demeanor, reminding everyone that insight and forbearance were essential in both fending off personal and public issues. The family went to a secluded area, out of sight of cameras and journalists. The steps of the courthouse, now a podium of drama, were transformed into a silent room of discussion, contemplation, and reconciliation. Words were uttered slowly, deliberately, words of frustration, hurt, and misconceptions, are intermingled with words of loyalty, concern, and shared heritage. For the Brown family, the verdict was not the conclusion of their tale. It was a starting point for candid conversation, self-reflection, and transformation. Kody addressed his wives directly. "We've faced a public trial, but we've also faced decades of private challenges together," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This verdict doesn't define us. It reflects decisions, mistakes, and human complexity. But it doesn't erase our love, our commitment, or our ability to move forward." His words were both acknowledgement and encouragement, a reminder that despite legal outcomes, family bonds were resilient. The wives reacted in return, individually expressing a blend of support, concern, and hope. Robyn stressed the value of unity and communication. Janelle spoke of fairness and empathy. Christine talked of learning from previous conflicts and the importance of teamwork. Meri reminded everyone that perspective and emotional resilience were essential to getting moving again. Combined, their thoughts created a mosaic of human feeling, meshing vulnerability with tenacity, showing that family, despite its problems, is the central fulcrum in life's storm. Outside, the news media kept reporting, but Brown family's personal introspection was a counterpoint to the circus. Their narrative, though publicly analyzed, held deeper meanings regarding loyalty, concessions, and the complex dynamics of a blended non-traditional family. Everyone knew that public opinion was fleeting, but the relationships they fostered with each other would last longer than headlines, hashtags, and viral videos. The days after the verdict saw the family reconcile legal findings with personal realities. Finances, household responsibilities, and relationships became considered with more purpose. Lessons learned from the trial guiding decisions. Public attention, while relentless, also became a mirror reflecting strengths and weaknesses, as well as the resilience needed to live both as a family and as public figures. Kody reflected in solitude on the Odyssey, moving forward through errors, honoring achievements, and strategizing for an existence where transparency, equity, and emotional sensitivity were blended. He comprehended that leadership wasn't perfection, but rather responsibility, answerability, and the ability to meet adversity head-on. The courtroom had revealed weaknesses, but it had also accentuated tenacity, perseverance, and the ability to learn from experience. In the end, the Brown family came out of the trial altered but unbroken. The verdict, as shocking and dramatic as it was, had evolved into a turning point, a time of introspection, learning, and strengthening. Cameras and tabloids would eventually disappear, public interest would wane, but the ties of family, the lessons of the trial, and the collective experience of Kody and his wives would remain. As they left the courthouse square, arm in arm, side by side, a feeling of guarded hope. The tempest of public opinion had passed, bringing in its wake clarity, comprehension, and the prospect to rebuild stronger bonds. They had faced legal examination, emotional intensity, and public scrutiny, and had come out with fresh insight into love, responsibility, and strength. The Brown family's saga, photographed and broadcast to millions of people all over the world, had become more than a drama of the courtroom. It became an epic of the human condition, of performing with courage in the face of conflict, of reconciling emotion and intellect, and of achieving cohesion out of discord. For the wives and Kody, it was both a reckoning and a new beginning, a time for growing up, for mending, and for further writing of their remarkable joint narrative. Ultimately, the courtroom had produced not only legal verdicts, but the richness of human feeling, the complexity of leadership, and the abiding power of family. And as the Brown family moved on into the next phase of their lives, they bore with them the lessons, insights, and resilience, shaped in the ferocious crucible of trial, media scrutiny, and mutual history.